Dayton's accident raised questions nobody expected, and the answer gets even more surprising, so stay with me. What really happened behind the scenes when Dayton Brown was injured, and why did questions about medical coverage suddenly bring the Brown family finances back into the spotlight for Sister Wives fans? The story may look simple at first, but the deeper you look, the more complicated it becomes, because this was never just about one accident or one medical bill. It was about a family trying to navigate healthcare, money, relationships, and difficult decisions while cameras were watching. And according to reports and fan discussions, there were still many unanswered questions surrounding what happened after Dayton Brown experienced an ATV accident years ago. Dayton reportedly suffered a serious injury around the time the Brown family was living in Las Vegas, and the accident eventually became one of those moments that fans remembered, even though the full details were never shown on television. What made the situation especially interesting was the fact that Dayton was one of Robin Brown's children, and fans had already watched the family struggle with medical expenses during earlier seasons of Sister Wives. So, when Dayton later appeared to have received treatment for the injury, viewers naturally began asking how the costs had been handled. The important point is that many details circulating online have never been independently confirmed, and some of the stories repeated by fans are based on speculation rather than official financial records. But that uncertainty is exactly what kept the conversation alive, because viewers wanted to understand whether the family had adequate health insurance at the time, and whether the different children received similar access to medical care. The Brown family had previously faced difficult medical situations, including Isabel Brown's battle with scoliosis and her eventual surgery, and that storyline became one of the most emotional medical stories ever shown on Sister Wives. Fans watched Christine Brown fight for her daughter's treatment while difficult conversations about money, travel insurance, and family support unfolded around her. And because viewers remembered that experience, they naturally compared it with what they believed happened when Dayton was injured years earlier. The comparison created a much bigger question about the family's financial priorities, and that question became even more complicated because the Brown family structure was never financially simple. They were raising many children across multiple households while also dealing with mortgages, businesses, travel, television income, and changing living arrangements. So even when fans thought they understood the family's finances, there were always details they could not see from the television screen. Some older reports suggested that the family did have health insurance at certain points, and that medical expenses were not necessarily paid entirely out of pocket. But there have also been claims about unpaid medical bills and financial pressure connected to the family's homes. Those claims have circulated for years and should be treated carefully, because not every detail repeated online has been verified by the family or by official records. Still, the questions continued, and eventually the conversation moved beyond Dayton and toward another major disagreement involving Christine and Janelle Brown's housing situation. By this point, the Brown family was already changing dramatically. Christine was becoming increasingly unhappy with her relationship with Cody, while Janelle was dealing with housing uncertainty after her Flagstaff rental situation changed. When Christine decided to leave Cody and move toward a new life in Utah, the future of her Flagstaff property became another unexpected source of tension. Christine reportedly had an opportunity to sell the house, and according to what was discussed on the show, Cody wanted Janelle to consider purchasing it. At first glance, that idea might sound practical. Janelle needed housing, Christine had a property available, and keeping a home within the family could have seemed financially convenient. But there was another side to the story that made fans question the motivation behind the suggestion. Janelle had her own plans and her own financial priorities, and the idea of purchasing the house previously occupied by Christine and Cody was not necessarily something she had asked for or wanted. That is where the situation became more uncomfortable, because fans began wondering whether the proposal was really about helping Janelle or whether Cody simply wanted to keep control over a property connected to the family. Even though there is no reliable evidence proving that this was his intention, the speculation became part of a much larger conversation about ownership, independence, and the changing power dynamics inside the Brown family. Janelle eventually moved into an RV while waiting for the next chapter of her life to unfold, and that decision became one of the most talked about moments of the series. Viewers saw her attempt to make the unusual living arrangement work while she continued thinking about the future of Coyote Pass and her plans for the property. Cody, meanwhile, reacted strongly to the situation, and his comments about the RV created another wave of discussion among fans. Some viewers saw Janelle as someone choosing independence, while others wondered why the family could not provide a more stable solution for her. The bigger issue, however, was that the Brown marriages were no longer functioning in the same way they once had. Christine had already reached the point where she was ready to leave, and she eventually moved forward with her decision to separate from Cody, while Janelle was also becoming increasingly independent. Mary Brown had her own business and financial interests, and the family that viewers once watched living under one shared vision was gradually becoming several separate lives. Another question appeared: what would happen to the family assets and the promises that had been made when everyone still believed they would remain together for the long term? That question would eventually bring attention back to Coyote Pass property ownership and financial responsibility, and it would force fans to reconsider almost everything they thought they understood about the Brown family, because when a family stays together, financial compromises can remain invisible, but when people separate, every old decision can suddenly look completely different, and that is why the Dayton questions, the Christine house situation, the RV years, and the Coyote Pass story remain connected in the eyes of many viewers, not because every rumor is true, but because each chapter reveals another piece of a family that was slowly changing. And as the Brown children grew older, they began creating lives of their own, which meant the old family structure could no longer operate exactly as it had before. And that brings us back to the question that started this entire conversation. If the Brown family was already struggling with medical costs, housing decisions, and financial pressure years ago, what happened when the marriages themselves began to collapse and the shared financial system had to face the reality of separate lives? That is where the next chapter becomes even more revealing, because the decisions made around those properties and family assets would become some of the most closely watched moments in the entire Sister Wives story. And once those details started coming into view, fans began looking at the earlier medical and housing controversies from an entirely different perspective. As the Brown family continued moving into separate chapters, the questions surrounding money, property, and responsibility became harder to ignore, because once people who had shared a family structure for years began making independent decisions, every old financial arrangement suddenly looked different from the outside. And that is exactly what happened with the Brown family. As Christine, Janelle, and Mary gradually became more independent while Cody and Robin continued building their life together, the biggest change was that the idea of one shared future no longer seemed realistic, and viewers began paying closer attention to who owned what, who was responsible for which expenses, and how the family would handle the property they had once planned to develop together. Coyote Pass became especially important because it represented the future the family had imagined when they first moved to Flagstaff. The plan had been ambitious. The adults would eventually build homes on the land and create a new version of their family life. But years passed, and the dream remained unfinished. Instead of becoming the center of a new family community, the property became a symbol of everything that had changed. Christine left, Janelle became more independent, Mary continued her own life, and Cody and Robin remained together while the original vision slowly faded. And this is where fans began asking whether the land would eventually have to be divided or sold, because maintaining a property without the original plan could create new financial questions, and those questions became even more important as the relationships changed. What made the situation so fascinating was that each person seemed to have a different idea of what financial independence should look like. Christine wanted freedom from the old arrangement. Janelle wanted to protect her future. Mary had already demonstrated that she could build income through her own work, and Robin and Cody were focused on their household and children. From the outside, it looked like four completely different financial paths emerging from one family, and the more those paths separated, the harder it became to imagine how the original family finances could continue working the same way. This also changed the way viewers interpreted older moments from the show, because Conversations that once seemed like ordinary family disagreements suddenly looked like early signs of deeper problems. Housing was one of those issues, and Janelle became a major example when she faced uncertainty over her rental home and eventually chose an RV lifestyle rather than immediately committing to another expensive long-term arrangement. Some viewers admired the decision because Janelle had always spoken about wanting flexibility and owning land, while others questioned why a woman who had spent years contributing to the family system was now facing such an uncertain housing situation. Regardless of which interpretation a viewer preferred, the moment showed that the old system was changing, and Janelle was beginning to think about herself as an individual rather than simply as one part of a larger household structure. Christine was going through an even bigger transformation because after leaving Cody, she did not simply move away and disappear. She began rebuilding her identity in public, and her relationship with David Woolley became a major part of that process. The two appeared increasingly comfortable together, and Christine openly embraced a future that looked very different from her previous life. Fans who had watched her struggle with difficult conversations years earlier now saw someone who appeared more confident and willing to make decisions based on her own happiness. That transformation also changed how viewers looked at her earlier financial and family conflicts, because leaving a long-term relationship can force someone to reconsider everything from housing to income to personal goals, and Christine appeared determined to create a life where she could make those choices without waiting for the rest of the family to agree. At the same time, Janelle was navigating her own transition, and the relationship between Christine and Janelle became one of the most positive parts of the post-separation story. Their friendship had survived the collapse of the plural family structure, and that mattered because it showed that leaving the same marriage did not necessarily mean leaving every relationship behind. Instead, some connections became stronger once the pressure of the old structure was removed, and that is one reason fans continued following their lives even after their relationships with Cody changed. But while the public focused on the emotional transformation, another issue remained in the background: the children and their individual experiences. For years, the Brown children had grown up in a complicated family structure with multiple homes, different mothers, and changing financial circumstances. And as they became adults, their relationships with their parents also evolved. Some stayed close, some became more independent, and some appeared to establish stronger boundaries. These changes were especially important because the children were no longer simply part of the family story. They were becoming adults with their own opinions and their own expectations, and that meant the decisions made by the parents could be viewed differently by the next generation. This is another reason why the older medical stories continued to attract attention. When a child experiences a serious health issue, parents are expected to make decisions quickly and carefully, and fans remembered the Brown family dealing with those situations in different ways. Isabel's scoliosis treatment became one of the most emotional examples because the decision surrounding her surgery involved travel, timing, finances, and family support, while Dayton had his own medical history after his ATV accident. The two stories were not identical, and there is no reliable basis for assuming that every detail was handled in the same way, but viewers naturally compared them because both involved children and medical needs, and because the show revealed different levels of information about different situations. That comparison created ongoing debate online. However, one thing is important to remember: reality television does not always show every private financial or medical detail, so viewers cannot know everything that happened behind closed doors, and rumors circulating on social media should not be treated as proof. The real story is often more complicated than the version that spreads online, and that uncertainty became part of the Brown family narrative itself, because the less information the audience received, the more questions they had, and the more those questions were discussed, the more attention the family received. This cycle became especially powerful when property and money entered the conversation, because financial decisions can reveal priorities that ordinary conversations do not. And once the marriages began separating, viewers wanted to know whether the adults would divide their assets fairly and whether everyone would leave the family structure with enough independence to build a new life. That question became particularly important for Christine and Janelle because both had spent years participating in a shared financial system, and both eventually had to think about their own futures independently. Christine had already moved forward with David, while Janelle was exploring new opportunities and thinking about her future away from the old family arrangement. Mary was also continuing to build her own path, and this meant that the original family was no longer moving toward one destination. Instead, everyone seemed to be moving in different directions, and Coyote Pass remained as one of the last physical reminders of the dream they had once shared. But the longer the property remained unresolved, the more obvious it became that something eventually had to happen with it. And when viewers began hearing more about the future of the land, the conversation shifted from emotional family drama to something much more practical: who would keep the property and who would walk away. And that question matters, because the answer could affect more than. And that's where the story takes another turn. If you want the next Sister Wives update, first subscribe now and stay tuned.